Jackie Jones and welcome to my podcast, Living Life Being Human, the #1 podcast for anxiety, stress and mental health support. Don't forget to click subscribe to be notified of my latest podcast episodes. And if you get any value from this podcast, please support me by leaving a review. It really does help me out and it motivates me to keep making these podcasts. You can connect with me on social media at Jackie Jones Coaching, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel to get weekly videos all around anxiety, stress and mental health. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the next episode of the Living Life Being Human podcast, and I've got a wonderful guest, Dr Damian. I've never had a doctor on before, so I'm very honoured. Dr Damian Wilde, and I'm going to read a little bit about his bio and then we'll maybe talk about how we got to meet each other. So
call me I've said before, Jackie, but just call me Damian.
Damian. Okay. I quite like Dr. D. I like that.
Well, you call me whatever you like, but I think usually the doctor title only goes on sort of formal work letters, and anyone I meet, whether it be a client, professional, I always say, let's cut down the kind of power kind of dynamic and just call me Damian.
Okay, Damian. I do like Dr. D though. That makes you enter. So after completing a psychology degree, Damian qualified as a primary school teacher, and having an interest in clinical psychology, he gained practical experience in a children's home as a care worker and also in positions such as assistant psychologist and psychological wellbeing practitioner in the child and adolescent psychology services. There's lots of big words in here, and I'm not a big word person. After completing a clinical psychology doctorate, Damian worked as a clinical psychologist in CAMHS, which he absolutely loved. He now works as a psychotherapy service, and his main passion is working therapeutically with people on a one-to-one basis, providing a safe, containing, exploratory space. I love that. I love the way that's phrased. Damian works psychodynamically, but integratively where needed. And Damian enjoys, these are the big words that get me, neuropsychological assessment, teaching, research and supervision, particularly of trainee clinical psychologists, which I think you touched on is one of your passions in supporting other trainees and how to get there and all those sorts of things. And Damian is a committee member of the Division of Clinical Psychology, the DCP, the Northwest branch, helping to promote psychology locally. Wow. What a bio that is.
Yeah, just to add a tiny bit there, I'm not doing the DCP committee work at the moment. I did previously. But sometimes, you know what it's like, you have to kind of weigh things up and look at your time commitments.
Yeah.
So that's not something I'm doing currently, but the rest of it, yes, accurate.
Yeah. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I read all this is that mine and your career paths are quite similar, only yours was at a much more academic level than what mine was. So, and I'm interested to know more about the clinical psychologist side of things, as opposed to me being a psychotherapist in private practice. What's the difference?
I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap in the work that we do, because I mean, the thing is with clinical psychologists is often people can have different sort of areas of specialism. So you might get some clinical psychologists who do purely research-based jobs.
Yeah.
You can work in a lot of different areas. A colleague of mine used to be president of BPS. He used to work for the Ministry of Defence.
Wow.
I mean, some people work sort of consultancy-based jobs. Giving advice to sort of public health bodies. So clinical psychologists can be involved with sort of policy, health policy. You can work for mental health services, or, could be based in schools. Some work sort of the NHS, some work in private practice. So I think probably, I mean, me personally, sort of area, you touched upon it before, that I specialise in is psychodynamic psychotherapy. So quite a large part of the work I've done privately and for the NHS has been psychotherapy. And I suppose that's the kind of main kind of central bit of where our each job is. Obviously, if someone comes to a service I'm working in, or someone comes to you, they'll often say, I'm struggling. Things have happened to me. My needs are not being met. Can you help me to get my needs met? And that's the bit which is similar. I think when we're training, sort of, as well as the clinical side of things, we've got various clinical competencies to meet, is we have to carry out research as well. So there are kind of academic and research elements to what we do, but they're not just there in case you might purely work in a research job, or you're carrying out research as part of your job. They like us to sort of, well, we were training what's called the scientist practitioner model. So if we've got the research skills as well, say, for example, someone gives us a research paper saying, oh, this new therapy is really effective for people who've experienced trauma. We've then got the scientific critique skills to be able to analyze the research and say, well, is this research good quality? And so ensuring that we're working from a good sort of scientific evidence base. But I think there's balance to that. And I don't know what your views on this are, but I think the evidence base is critical and important and working scientifically. But I also think there's a balance to be had, because I remember early on in my career, when I was an assistant psychologist, the supervisor said to me, a clinical psychologist, you can't always take your manual into a room with a client.
True.
Just because the RCT said this, So what we got to remember, I mean, a very wise supervisor of mine, he's a psychoanalyst, during my clinical psychology doctorate, said to me, you can't box humans.
100%. I love whoever that was. Yeah, we're all unique.
She said that, and the other thing she said to me was, Damian, humans are complex.
Yeah. I can remember on my training, they would say, when somebody presents with this, then it's because of X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, yeah, I've got that. And they said, but it can also be because of A, B, and C, and E, F, D. And it's like, oh no, what's all that about? I'm quite a logical person. I like a structure to follow, and I soon learned that that's not going to serve me well. So it's okay to have a fundamental, idea, but I'm one of those people that constantly reassess and reevaluate. I've had clients that come for one subject, and 6 months in, suddenly they spring something else on you that actually, is maybe more important. So for me, I'm one of those people that always say it's the therapeutic relationship that matters, as opposed to the modality that is being used in the room. I'm not precious about transactional analysis. I'm open to learning lots of different approaches.
Yeah, no, I think you touch upon a good point, Jackie. There's a lot of research to say that actually an essential fundamental element of psychotherapy and working psychologically is that kind of therapeutic relationship, because it's a very, very special relationship. I mean, sometimes people who don't work in psychology and psychotherapy will say to me, oh, well, what's it like, working with clients? And I'll say, you know what, I can honestly say I really like all the clients that I work with, and the relationships are incredibly special. Because I think obviously you need to have been trained properly. You need to be working in sound kind of psychological ways, but also what you've got to model actually is that this is a safe, trustworthy, non-judgmental relationship, right? And not only do we end up being, special to them, but they end up being special to us. And as well as the psychological work that we do, sometimes, you kind of share sort of warm, humorous moments together,
Which
and they go out
when we're talking about quite deep traumatic events, that we can still smile and see the humorous side of things sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they go away thinking, okay, I matter to Damian, or, you know, I matter to Jackie.
Yeah.
And maybe they don't get that elsewhere in their life, where they've not mattered to people.
Yes.
You know? And the thing is, as well, it's done in a very genuine way. It's not like, I never say things for the sake of it. You know, when I'm with a client, anything that I say is always genuine.
Yeah. And I think that kind of shocks some people, you know, that I started way years ago doing person-centered counselling. And one of the things that really stuck me with that was that I had to leave myself to a certain extent outside the therapy room door. And I really struggled with that. I was like, yeah, that's not how I want to work with people. You know, I bring myself in the room as well. And sometimes I get emotional with clients. Sometimes, if it's relevant, I will share personal experiences with the client to normalize, you know, certain things, not to take away from what they're experiencing, but to kind of let them know that it's okay.
Yeah, that's actually been a topic of debate recently in sort of psychology circles, about how much your own experiences you bring into this. And I know that there's a really good organization called Integrate Mental Health, which is run by two fantastic clinical psychologists, Natalie and Anna, and their organization is about helping support mental health professionals who've had their own sort of personal struggles, sort of, you know, emotionally and psychologically. And actually, that there's work around reducing stigma around that, ensuring that people get good support, and actually that people's own experiences should be valued and actually can sort of work well with the work that you do. Because I know what you mean, where you were saying, I think, you know, at times we need to be sort of boundaried and think about that, but it's your own sort of judgment, isn't it?
Yeah.
If a client is, I from my experience, I think it can be sort of done in a couple of ways. Sometimes if a client's talking about a difficult experience that they've had, of course I'm thinking about, okay, how can we understand this psychologically and work with it? But if you've experienced it yourself and you know what works well to get through that, you might say something without actually saying, oh, well, actually, I went through this.
Yeah.
Right. And say, well, what could be really helpful? It sounds like, you know, you can do a little bit around the understanding around it and say, actually, what might help is this. There might be times when it is okay as well to say, well, actually, you know, I once had a struggle with this. Because, I mean, when I worked in CAMS, you know, I was working with young people who sometimes be anxious about would they get enough GCSEs and the pressure on them. And sometimes perfectionism will be creeping in, and there'd be all these different dynamics. And sometimes I'd say, well, you know what? I started off with 2 GCSEs, you know? And, you know, I was disappointed, but I built up and I got to where I wanted to get to. So that, I suppose, is an example where I brought in a personal experience. I think there's a balance to be had with it, because when we've had this debate, I've always said to people, bring it in where needed, use your judgment, but remember it's the other person's space.
100%. Yeah. I totally agree. It's kind of like, for me, the only way that I can equate it is, you know, being a parent and having had children. I would much rather have a midwife that's gone through the process than have somebody that's never given birth to a child. There's a certain amount of understanding and empathy that goes along with being, you know, on that journey together. And I always see the fundamentals with transactional analysis is I'm okay, you're okay. I haven't got all the answers in that room. It's an exploratory thing for me when we're in there together, and, you know, we're both on the same level on the journey together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it is a sort of journey and a process. And I think what everyone brings in is human experience.
Yeah.
And because I don't necessarily think that someone has to have experienced like a major kind of, sometimes we think about how we word these things, or a major kind of mental health difficulty or a struggle, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Because each and every day, all of us go through kind of relational, societal kind of pressures and experiences. And of course, like, I think in our job, I think we do bring some of our own personality into it. Yeah. I noticed that at an early age when I was an assistant psychologist and trying to gain a place on the doctorate. And yes, I talk about being professional and working ethically and being boundaried. But I also thought, you know what? I bring a little bit of my own personality into the job, particularly when I was working in CAMS.
Yes.
You know, I think one of the biggest skills that we have in our job is engagement skills, right? I remember during the doctorate, we'd always get, after each placement, we'd always get commented on different areas like formulation skills, intervention skills. And I'd often have things to work on, but probably my best comments were on engagement skills. And I think you've got to be able to relate to different people. And part of that was part of my upbringing, where, wherever we were took, whether it be someone who lived in a very tiny house, or a big house, wherever we were taught to be comfortable and polite and respect people and engage with them on whatever level or whatever situation that it was. And I took that into my work. And so, sometimes like in CAMS or other services, you might get someone who quietly comes in who doesn't say anything, or, like sometimes working in CAMS, you get, the young person, the parents, maybe the siblings that turn up, and you got like 5 people in a room, and the siblings are running around the room, and you're trying to speak to the young person and the parents. Like I remember once where like the young person and the parents were getting distracted by the 2 siblings. So I sort of, I can make quite good paper aeroplanes, and I quickly grabbed some paper, made some paper aeroplanes, give them to siblings, and that kept them entertained for sort of half an hour.
Multitasking, love it. That's where your school teacher bit came into its own. So you touched a little bit on it there about how we work ethically, and we met online. I'm going to say it, not in a dating agency. It was on a Facebook group, and we were in there looking at maybe unregulated practitioners, and whether it's because of the pandemic and what we're going through, that there's an awful lot of people claiming certain things. And for me, my qualification is really important to me, not necessarily because I can say, oh, I've got this qualification, but there's a certain level of trust that goes along with that. Having said that, I've never actually been asked by any clients to see, my qualifications or ask me, am I a qualified practitioner, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think, I suppose a couple of points touching upon there is that if somebody says, oh, I'm a psychologist, I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a mental health practitioner, or, I'm a life coach, or whatever it is, right? I think people in vulnerable situations, there can be an expectation of like, Bob, oh yeah, well, look, he says he can provide this, he's good at that. I think sometimes people don't necessarily think about asking those questions. It's absolutely fine to ask those questions. I mean, you're right, it's rare, but I have been asked before. I think one person in one service once asked me all my qualifications, where I trained and all of those types of questions. And people absolutely have the right to know that. Maybe, I think in certain services, like if you're working for the NHS, they know you've been through a rigorous DBS check, right? They know that you'll be aligned to a regulatory body, right? So maybe that gives them a certain amount of confidence that actually you are properly qualified, you're properly monitored, etc., right? But I think, we met in terms of, I suppose, the group we're involved with is around unregulated practitioners who might advertise online a lot and put out there kind of sort of claims which, might entice vulnerable people in, and then they pay out lots of money and then they don't get what they were promised, but then there's nowhere for them to complain because these independent practitioners are not aligned to a regulatory body, right? And I also sort of agree with one of your other points about saying, actually, it's not about necessarily saying, oh, I've got these qualifications, but probably to you, like to me personally, like my training period was incredibly important and special to me. The journey to get there, and I sent you that article that I wrote, didn't I, which I've given out to a lot of aspiring psychologists. And actually the doctorate itself was very special to me. So it's, it's got personal meaning to us, doesn't it, in terms of what you've achieved, what I've achieved, what different people have achieved. But and I suppose the other point is you're saying about working ethically, right? We know that through our training, but also maybe our personal background, is that we're there to help people, right? We work ethically, that we show integrity, that we work hard, we do things properly, we communicate properly, we treat people with respect, right? And that we're actually, the other important point, I've had this conversation with a few people recently, is actually you're open to criticism. Because I know when I work with people, I always say to people, right, if there's ever a point in a session where you think it's not working for me or you didn't like something I've said, please put it forward. And I foster this space where people feel comfortable. And I'll give you an example. It was in my last job. I was working with a person. At one session, she said to me, oh, look, some things we did last week, it annoyed me a bit and it wasn't helpful. And rather than me feeling criticized or upset by it, I was really pleased that she'd actually brought that to session. We reflected upon it, we worked through it, and then we ended up going on, to do a really good piece of work and discharge with a really good outcome. And actually, if something doesn't feel quite right for a client, to say, hey, you know what, I'm not feeling any change, or I feel worse. Is that a good ethical practitioner will actually say, hey, look, I'm really glad you raised that. It's really important that you're able to say what you feel, because
that to me is what trust you have built up with that client, that they felt comfortable and able to actually bring that up in the session. That speaks volumes to me. They didn't just disappear. They felt something and brought it back in the next session, which to me is exactly how it should be. Yeah.
And if you go back to something fundamental that I often say to clients when I start working with them, I've got this basic right sheet. Okay, now it might sound simple to some people, right? But my supervisor in my last job, he was brilliant, like absolutely brilliant. May. She gave me the sheet and she said, look, when you're working with some people, they're not aware of basic human rights. And the one at the top says, you have a right to express how you feel, okay? And some people, where they've been blocked or shouted down or abused or emotionally neglected, often are like, oh, well, I can say how I feel, is that okay, right? And so it comes back to the point I was making there about if someone's like, oh, hey, you know, I feel uncomfortable in therapy or whatever type of intervention it is, they're able to express how they feel in and out of the room. That should be more than that should be okay. And I know we came together because, you know, there were certain practitioners out there when they receive criticism, is that, you know, then they're actually being, you know, verbally or attacked from a text sort of electronic perspective, and that's wrong, and that needs to be sort of called out. And I think we might see more of this coming up, because there's a BBC journalist, I won't say kind of who, but he's in the middle of making a TV documentary, and this is about various unregulated practitioners, and it came about because he himself sought private help and felt worse, and is a journalist himself, and then actually has gone on, is in the middle of making this program, and he interviews various people, one of whom I put forward, who'd used you know, a method from someone who's popped up in the group as, you know, sort of being a little unscrupulous. So I think this work, the BBC journalist, will highlight the fact that unregulated independent practitioner, that area is something that needs to be worked on, and maybe the government needs to look at this.
Yeah, 100%. I think everything that you've said is so valid, and particularly, you know, about being able to take criticism and be open to criticism. And the opposite of that is how powerful it is to just provide a safe space for somebody. I'm not sure how your training was, but my training, you know, part of it was I had to undergo personal therapy for 4 years while I was doing my training. I went into my training thinking I was absolutely fine. Little did I know, 6 months in, oh, wow, look at all this baggage I've got. But one of the things that will always stick in my mind was going to see a therapist, and I said to him, probably 10, 15 minutes in, is it okay if I just nip to the toilet? And he said, yes, of course, you don't need to nip. You can take all the time you need. And even now, it makes me emotional. You know, part of my upbringing was that everything needed to be done quickly, and I couldn't take time or space for me. It was always, you know, meeting other people's needs and not necessarily looking after myself. And for somebody that I'd only just met to point that out to me, I will take that to my grave. That's how, you know, important having a safe space to share, to give and to receive things is so important.
Yeah, and you were seeking permission as well to go.
Yeah, that's me all over. And I think that's one of the things that I take into the room. You know, I've got my driver behaviours because of my upbringing. You know, we all develop a certain personality because of the events that we go through in our life. That's being a human being, and it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just want to sort of go through a couple of points you made. I think understandable reactions are important, because I mean, I don't use diagnosis in my job, and sort of I'm against use of psychiatric diagnosis in understanding emotional and psychological distress, but it just made me think of that then, because and sometimes we'll get accused of saying, oh, you're saying that this is a normal experience, and that's not what we're saying at all. I mean, people we see are going through some horrendous experiences, absolutely horrific. This debilitating, this massively impacting upon their quality of life. Some people who are struggling to function at the most basic level.
Yeah.
But I suppose what you're talking about there is, if you have certain human and relational experiences, if you're treated badly, if your psychological needs are not met, you will struggle. Yeah. But there's a link there, you know, like, okay, you were in that relationship, or this was neglected in your childhood. Because sometimes I'll ask questions during assessment, and one question which pretty much always gets a no is, I'll say, when you were younger, did you have anyone to take your feelings to when maybe, you know, something difficult or frustrating or sad had happened, and virtually everyone says no, right? So if you think about, you know, got young kids in and amongst my family circle, if they fall over and slightly graze their knee, it's like a, you know, a massive disaster, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So imagine someone who's getting abused in some way, or what I was touching upon there is emotionally neglected. So, you know, they have a horrible day at school. They don't have someone to go to and say, hey, I feel really sad. This, you know, this happened, you know, or I was shouted at, or I fell out with a friend. And so what they're doing is then it's all getting internalized, right? And that impacts upon people when they're adults, right? So it goes back to my, you know, one of my previous supervisors, the psychoanalyst, who said, you know, humans are complex. But yeah, I think it's important to say, well, that didn't happen because you've got a disorder, right? Actually, that happened because you were treated badly, or you know, you felt threatened in that situation, or you had a lack of opportunities. Right. But just the other couple of things I just wanted to touch upon that you mentioned as well is, you know, about having a space. And I know not just, you know, I read one of the articles that I sent you is about creating spaces for yourself, safe spaces. One space could be the therapy room. I mean, I think the therapy rooms, it's important to talk to family and friends, and that's essential if you have them. But it's a different space because, you know, the doorbell doesn't go, the phone doesn't go, it's non-judgmental. You can take anything you want to take there, right? It's a different space. Sometimes people will tell me things that they don't even tell their husband or wife, right? So, but also other spaces are important. Like tonight, I go to Pilates. That's such an important space for me. I go to the nature reserve and beach for a walk. That's a space for me. I mean, one thing during clinical psychology training that you did a huge amount about was, you know, self-care. You know, and it wasn't in a token way. It wasn't in, you know, nowadays some people say, oh, it's a bit fashionable, isn't it? It was really genuine in terms of how they did it. Although I do remember in first year, early on, when we didn't have too much work, and so we sort of worked clinically 3 days a week and we're at university 2 days. And I remember one Friday afternoon, we had sort of study research time Friday afternoon. And one of the girls says, right, I'm off for a massage, self-care.
That's it.
Although actually, I mean, I went for a massage and facial yesterday, and I actually think that's really good for physical and mental health. It's a space of my own, a quiet space, you know, where someone's looking after me. But yeah, just finally, just on the things that you were talking about before, that I wanted to touch upon is about personal therapy for mental health professionals, because I know in certain professional kind of roles, it is mandatory. Like, you know, in CAMS, I shared an office with a brilliant practitioner, Emma, trainee child psychotherapist. I think she was going 4 times a week.
Wow.
Mandatory, like often in counselling, psychotherapy, counselling, psychology training, it's mandatory. In clinical psychology, interestingly, it isn't. Now, I've raised this within the profession before and actually said, I think it should be mandatory. Because I know that I'm better at my job, because you spot nuances in your own therapy that I think otherwise you just wouldn't spot, right? Now, we didn't have to go, we were told about it. Interestingly, when I was working with Elisa, that supervisor, she said, look, you know, Damian, you're a very good therapist, but if you want to be fantastic, you've got to go and have your own therapy. So she got me a recommendation. She said, right, okay, my supervisor's recommended this person, Maureen. She said, and I trust my supervisor with my life. So I said, well, that's a good enough recommendation for me. So my actual first session was the last day of my the day the doctorate finished. So everyone's joking, saying, "Oh, you don't like endings." But it was a brilliant space. And then I moved back up north because I was down in Coventry. And I remember thinking, right, I want to find someone new. And then Emma recommended someone who was local. She met her at a conference or something, Julie, psychodynamic psychotherapist. And I went for a sort of an initial kind of appointment, and I went away, but I didn't return to start therapy with Julie until it must have been about maybe 4 or 6 months later. And do you know what stopped me? Is because I had a really good relationship with Maureen, I found it hard about the prospect of seeing someone new. And what that showed to me is, I don't know if you've seen it in services where, say if someone's leaving or, you know, or various other factors, oh, we'll just get them another therapist, it's fine. Actually, changing therapists can be quite difficult. And I got a bit of insight into personally how that felt. Now then, I did return to see Julie, and I've been going to see her for years now. Great space. In fact, it's this afternoon, every Thursday.
Brilliant.
Going there. And yeah, sometimes I talk about great things that happen, but also if there are people irritate me or treat me badly, I go in there and I know she gets it.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about not just something she says verbally, sometimes just her facial expressions. She'll give away a facial expression which communicates to me that person was a disgrace. And I just like it. Like, I love it if I think she gets it.
Yeah.
I really like it.
See, I refer to that as being truly seen and heard. You know, when the whole body is saying, I get it. Yeah, you don't need the words, I get it.
Well, you want to be, I mean, that's essential thing. It's not just listening, it's being heard. And that the part of that being heard is being understood. And it's a core human need to feel understood.
Yeah. And you touched on it a little bit there. So maybe just to finish off, we can have a little chat around labels. I'm an ex-foster carer, and yeah, I'm going to generalize here, but all of the children came with a label of one description. You know, one particular lad had every initial under the sun put on him. Diagnosis of this, that and the other. He was on Ritalin when he came. He was diagnosed with ADHD and oppositional defiance disorder. You name it, this kid had got it thrown at him. And one of the things I did as a foster carer was I needed to know the medical facts. I needed to know if they had any allergies, if they had any, you know, issues with the health or anything like that. The rest of it and how other foster carers interpreted them, I never read it, because I wanted to take those kids on face value when they came in. So as long as I could meet the medical needs, you know, and obviously, you know, all that sort of stuff, I wanted to start our relationship off with a clean slate. And that always served me well. I didn't need to know the labels that they'd got.
Yeah.
And sometimes it worked and sometimes it backfired, to be fair, but I didn't change my opinion on these kids.
Do you know what it reminded me of instantly when you were talking there about, I'll go back to her again, Lisa. So she had quite an influence on how I practice and how I then went to further develop in terms of working psychodynamically in the psychotherapy sort of practice sense. She said to me once, in terms of when sort of seeing new clients, she said, unless there's a specific risk element being highlighted to me by the referrer, I don't read any notes. I don't read any notes. And actually, I took that, and I don't. So in work, if I get a referral, what often people do is they'll get a referral, they'll go onto the electronic system. So I'm talking, say, NHS or maybe other private practices have their own electronic system.
Yeah.
There'll be reams of letters, there'll be reams of notes, and they'll go read the lot. I don't do it. No. And I actually say to people, at the start of the assessment, I'll explain, I've not read your notes, I'll explain why, and I'll say, I don't want to read or hear what other people have said about you. I want to hear it from you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So powerful.
Now, yeah, I mean, at that point, you've got to be delicate with it, because sometimes people are sick of seeing too many people, because they might have seen GP.
Yeah.
They might have gone to a single point of access kind of appointment. They might have been assessed by, a nurse practitioner. So there's sometimes going to be the element, I've got to tell my story again. And I totally get that. And that's where I was going before about not changing therapists and having relational consistency.
Yes.
Person who knows you, who knows your stuff, who knows who's who in your life. And when you mention a person like, oh yeah, that's your uncle, or that's your friend, that you always go out to dinner with on a Tuesday. But I think there is that element of what you were saying there is about going on a clean slate in terms of understanding the person who's in front of you, not like what someone else has said, well, this child or this adult, exhibits like, challenging behavior, and they sometimes, get annoyed by this or that. I'm like, well, actually, I'd rather ask them myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And, as a foster carer, I was a foster carer for 13 years, and it was a roller coaster. I can remember one particular lad that came, and he was only in the house for 2 hours before he ran off. And I can remember we had to phone the police and go through all the procedures and everything. And this police officer was asking me what colour his eyes were. And I was like, I haven't got a flipping clue. He was only here for 2 hours. So, but he came back, and that was his thing. That's what he did when things got too much for him. He ran off, and we made a deal that I'm not going to confine you. I'm not going to keep you here, but I need to know that you're safe when you go.
Yeah.
And we had a standing joke. I used to pretend to take a photograph of him, and he'd say, what are you doing that for? I said, so I can identify you and I can tell the police what you're wearing. Are you going to come back tonight? Yes, I'm coming back. And even when things are really heavy and stressful, you can still connect on a level of some sort with everybody. I think, yeah, it is that connection.
Yeah, the connection is important, and I think going back to your just slightly earlier point about kind of what some people might view as labels, it's a delicate area, because of course there will be some people out there who say, you know what, I received a diagnosis, it's been really helpful.
Yeah.
It gave me some understanding. It led to me receiving the correct intervention.
Yeah.
And then, so of course, I absolutely acknowledge that there are some people who will say it's helpful, and it can be helpful for certain system organizational perspectives and another thing. But I also think it's important to acknowledge actually that for some people it does harm. Okay. And I don't know, for example, you might get people, you were talking about, you've done a lot of fostering, right? Which is really admirable. And, you'll have been important to those people, and they'll look back and think, Jackie cared,
One of them knocked on the door the other day. I haven't seen him for over 10 years. And he said, I was just driving past and I couldn't not call. And I thought it was the Amazon man at first. And I just looked up and I was like, oh my God. Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I've still got a piece of them in me too. Yeah.
Yeah. He held you in mind, you held him in mind. So you're important. But we know often, I touched upon it before, often, not always, okay? Sometimes it can be to do with other reasons. But, a lot of the time it can be to do with kind of difficulties which are occurring in childhood. And you will have seen the devastation, right, through foster caring. If someone is neglected or abused or treated badly in some kind of an affected, I mean, in terms of, I don't know if you've read it, but a good book recommendation for people is a book called Why Love Matters. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing the surname correctly, but Sue Gerhardt.
Yeah. I was looking up there because I usually have it rattling around somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a copy, but in there it goes it's quite a big read, but it goes into detail about, okay, if a baby's needs are not met and they're not made to feel safe and secure and they're nurtured and they're developed in the correct way, then actually these are the problems that will happen in childhood, and these are the problems that will happen later on in adulthood. There is an explanation, okay? Now, for example, if someone has been, say, sexually abused as a child, and later on in adulthood, they're displaying, you know, they're feeling really emotionally and psychologically distressed, and they're displaying what others might deem as erratic behaviors, right? Is it acceptable to say to them, you have a personality disorder? You know, I personally think it's quite insulting.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you've got to question whose benefit is given the diagnosis for, because in my entire career, only one client has ever said to me, can you give me a diagnosis? All right. Now, I had to say I'm not diagnostically trained, so I can't do that. Right. But I don't think clients in the main come in saying, I want a diagnosis. It's often given by the professional involved, right? Now, all you've got is like, I mean, if, for example, you know, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, if you Googled that, does that give you, when a set of symptoms come up, does that give you an understanding of Bob or Sarah, right? Does it tell you about Bob and Sarah's life? No, it doesn't. So that's why we talked before about having that exploratory space in therapy, right? And then as clinical psychologists, we'll use something called formulation. So that's, you know, as I'm sure you know, is just kind of taking into account all the things that happen in the person's life, not just the past, but present, because sometimes people can come in and say, oh, you know what? The police are down our street all the time, got people throwing bricks through the window. That sort of pressure is going to make people feel psychologically uncomfortable and lead to a lot of distress. You have to take all the, of course, biology absolutely plays a part in it, and it's part of it. Okay, we know that through like books like Why Love Matters and various researches, the brain does change if people are neglected and abused in certain ways in childhood. Okay, so for me, it's like, rather than giving, you know, leaflets saying, well, you've got this disorder and these are the symptoms, what does that tell a person? I also think that it can, I've seen halt recovery where people are like, well, I've got this disease, I'm stuck like this, you know, and actually, or sometimes people will say, well, that happened on Friday night, but it was my such a disorder. So actually, you know, it's about, I'm interested in the person, you know, it's, oh, Jack, oh, you know, what's Jack struggle with? What does Jack like? What are the positive things? You know, actually the person, it comes back to the person and the life that they have around them, not stamping them with a label. And also what is then aligned with that is, you touched upon it before about some of the children you saw were given Ritalin. And of course, psychotropic medication for some people is absolutely vital and it absolutely has its place.
Yeah. 100%.
But I think what we see is an over-reliance upon any kind of problem. You know, some people's go-to is a client comes and say, oh, this has happened, or I'm feeling like this, or I'm getting intrusive thoughts, or okay, we'll give you this and we'll give you that for that. Next thing you know, people are on several medications, and this is kind of polypharmacy approach. Polypharmacy approach might be useful for some people, but then, you know what the regular thing I hear is, you know, when maybe doing assessment, oh, do you take any medications? Well, they gave me this, it didn't work, so they upped the dose, but that didn't work. So they gave me this one, it didn't work, and then they upped the dose, it didn't work. So then they gave me this one, it didn't work, the dose, it didn't work. So now on this one, is it helpful? No. Actually, I'd like to come off it, but I feel too scared to say anything. And there's like the power dynamic, because of course I think the thing is as well, I touched upon this earlier about title. The difference is often like psychotherapists, clinical psychologists, they do have the title of doctor, is they're virtually always called by the first name by clients. Now medics, I often hear clients call them doctor. So does it create this kind of sort of power imbalance? It's just one element, really. I'm not saying it's a significant element, but the other thing as well that clinical psychologists use, a group of sort of clinical psychologists, service users, if that's an okay term to use. I know sometimes people for using kind of different terms, put together a 5-year project. It's called the Power Threat Meaning Framework.
Wow.
So that was really just to try and put forward a framework, an alternative way to understand distress, rather than say solely relying upon psychiatric diagnosis. So I mean, it looks at, people will be able to find summary and overviews online of that, but it looks at, in terms of sort of key elements like the role of power in people's lives, and the role that threat plays. So it's, I suppose, trying to ensure that all the correct elements and factors and life experiences are taken into account and understood.
That's my one success story in life, I think, is probably one of the first kids that we looked after that had the diagnosis of ADHD and was on Ritalin. He came from a very chaotic background, as well as there being certain other things that went on, and with the help of CAMS we got him off his Ritalin and officially undiagnosed. There's nothing, he didn't need to be on it, and the only way we could do it, because he started to be reliant on it, if he didn't say his medication was working, then he would play up his behaviour. If he forgot to take it, or if something happened or whatever, he would blame not having it for his behaviour. So omega fish oil tablets were very similar to his Ritalin tablets. So under the advisory of CAMS, we started to reduce the amount slowly over time and replace them with omega fish oil, and there was no change in his behaviour whatsoever. And when we eventually told him that you're not actually on it anymore, this behavior is you, 100% you don't need it. And he was with us for 9 years. He's a dad now, he's got 2 kids. It's a wonderful.
I think the thing is, nobody denies that, say, like, so for example, if a child is displaying what others might deem as like quite extreme behaviors, no one sometimes will be accused of denying the seriousness of what's going on for a person. We're not denying that. And obviously when you had children come to you, you could say, actually, this is a problem, that's quite problematic, that's upsetting for them, that's a struggle for them. But I suppose what you were doing there is kind of formulating, saying all of those kind of, I don't want to use the kind of word symptoms because it's quite meta, but all those kind of presentations are there. Yes, I totally agree. But I think it's to do with other factors, and I don't think it's, say, ADHD. I think what he's displaying can be explained due to things that have happened in his past, or things that are happening currently, right?
And the behaviour was him trying to communicate something to us. It wasn't personal. Yes, it was aimed at me, but I knew it wasn't personal. He just didn't know how to let me know what was going on for him. I
think you touched upon a key point now, and people will often talk about it more so with children. You could argue this happens with adults. It's often people have something they want to communicate. They could feel distressed in some way. Something internal is occurring. and they might not quite have the words or the understanding to communicate it. So what you can see happen is, when I was a teacher, you might, sometimes, the reports go, oh, such a child threw a chair, in class. And then it's not helpful to kind of say, oh, well, maybe he's got conduct disorder, and that's why he threw the chair. Actually, it might be that child had an awful couple of days at home and they had no one to take the feelings to, and it built up to the level where they exploded. So I think that's important. The other thing I just wanted to touch upon is about as well, I think sounded like you sort of touched upon with the person you were, maybe there was a bit of placebo effect going on with the medication. I know there's a psychiatrist, Professor Joanna Moncrieff, who's published a lot of research on antidepressant medication. And a lot of the research has shown that actually it's no more effective than placebo. So I think, and then you start to think about, the amount of money that's spent on psychotropic medication. Could it be used better elsewhere? And sometimes, part of it, not all of it, obviously, but often people will say things like, well, no, look, this works and this does work. And I always say to people, look, it can be that certain things might not work as well. Because if you go years back to, Bedlam.
Yes, yeah.
So in Bedlam, the intervention of choice for people with mental health distress was purging. And so maybe at that time people were saying, no, that's a really cool thing to do. No, it really works. They're not telling to purge. They're not telling people to purge now, are they?
No, thank goodness.
So my point is, things can be wrong. There's this real kind of, it's all to do with power, isn't it? In terms of like pharmaceutical companies have got a lot of power. Certain professional bodies have got a lot of power. There's all these difficult power dynamics occurring. And we're also, as well, there's a group of people who are advocating and communicating at the moment in the area of electroconvulsive therapy. And large piece of research with Professor John Reed and someone over in Harvard as well, Irving, someone, I can't remember his surname. Again, their research has shown actually that ECT, I think they did like a big meta-analysis saying that, ECT is no more effective than placebo. And actually, in some people, ECT is causing brain damage. So there's a big kind of, that's quite topical in sort of the area of mental health at the moment. And again, I suppose the ECT would come under the banner of medical model mental health care. And you get people who are kind of very self-invested and being sort of very defensive. And I always say, well, listen, let's put our own kind of personal beliefs and own investments, and let's not self-protect. And let's actually remember what's good for the person. Sometimes, people will belittle, things like, oh, well, actually, exercise and use of green space is good for mental health. And no one's saying that alone is going to help someone recover. But actually, aspects like that, use of sort of green space are really good for mental health. All different elements should be taken into account. Diet, exercise, not just the psychological stuff that we, that we work with people. It's not just. That's why I think we shouldn't just get too stuck on, right, well, we've got to, the RCT said this, and we've got to do just that and that only, Everyone's different, aren't they?
100%. I think that's a wonderful place to finish it, is that it's not a one size fits all. Whether you're a psychotherapist or a clinical psychologist or a psychoanalyst or we're all, as long as we're focusing on the person in front of us in that moment and giving them, a non-judgmental safe space to explore whatever's going on, we're all unique. And not only am I unique, but I'm different on a Monday to a Tuesday, and a Tuesday morning I feel different to what I do on a Tuesday night, and it's
moods can change hour to hour,
minute to minute if you're going through the menopause. Believe me.
I mean, I think just maybe to finish on as well, in terms of, I remember May, my previous supervisor, said to me once, in terms of how people interact with each other, she said, and it's very simple, but actually it really stuck with me. She said, angry meets angry, nice meets nice.
Love it. And you've been very nice today. Thank you.
So have you. See, nice meets nice.
Nice meets nice. Yeah, we need to do this again sometime. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no, happy. Thank you for providing this space for me, and yeah, I'd be happy to come on again. But yeah, thank you, Jack. It's been very interesting.
Just to finish off, if people want to connect with you, how's the best way for them to do that? Is there a way that people can connect with you or see your?
Yeah. I mean, I help a lot of aspiring psychologists on LinkedIn.
Right.
Some on there is Dr Damian Wilde. Damian is spelled I-A-N.
Yeah.
Everyone always spells it wrong. Wilde is W-I-L-D-E. And there's been a lot of, been doing a lot of work on there just the last few days around. I put out an article about how best to go about and write your doctorate in clinical psychology application form and how to prepare for interview. I just put that out there, and suddenly it's kind of gone a bit wild. Pardon the pun. Lots of connection requests and lots of messages, and
brilliant.
So I do like to help, aspiring psychologists and others in terms of on their journey. So there's there. I'm also on Twitter, which is at Dr DJ Wilde. So yeah, Wilde with an E.
Yeah. I'll put the links in the show notes for the podcast so that people can just click on it and away you go. Yeah,
so sometimes people with, the Dr. DJ Wilde, because the middle name's Joseph, sometimes people think I'm a world famous DJ.
You should be. You should be. Do a bit of rapping.
Bring in the tracks to the masses, yeah.
Right, I'll catch up with you very soon. Thank you so much, Damian. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
All right, cheers, Jackie.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of the Living Life Being Human podcast. Please follow on Apple Podcasts and leave me a review. And if you got value from this episode, please share it so that others can get value from it too. You can connect with me on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Jackie Jones Coaching, or you can visit my website, jackiejones.co.uk, and click on the free resources tab at the top of the page for all my free and paid support. Thanks for listening.